All right, let's finish up with another huge area that we'll come back to and talk a little bit more about in another chapter. This is East Asia. So this is another indication or another location where independent invention or independent domestication of plant and animal species took place. There's some information that's still lacking about some of these, but we do have a little bit of information that I'd like to go over right here. So the important plants that we need to think about are essentially rice and millet. These are the two major grains that were developed. Rice, there's evidence for 9,000 years ago, and millet maybe up to 10,000 years ago at the site of Xishan, which in northern China, that was we thought it was about 8,000 years ago, as late as that, but we have direct dates from millet in Xishan that says that it may go back as far as domesticated millet as far as 10,000 BC. Also, water caltrop and foxnut were also domesticated here. And then animals, dogs, as in many places, were domesticated, but also pigs and water buffalo in southern China. And in northern China, pigs and chickens, probably from fowl that were found, wild fowl that was found in some of the rainforests in northern China. So as you can see, pigs overlap there. So which invented them? Well, maybe both. Maybe it was there was some diffusion. So there are overlapping stories of domestication of the pig in this area. And then we also have Japan, which has a very long period called the Jomon period, which lasted from 13,000 to 2,500 years ago. So that's 11,000 to 11,000 BC to 500 BC. That's a huge period of time. That's 10,000 years of a period. But they never really developed domesticated plants or animals until the very end of this period. So like the last 1,000 years of this 10,000 year period, they started incorporating rice and millet into their subsistence. But these were essentially hunters and gatherers, but that lived in sedentary communities, sometimes large, multiple pit house villages, sometimes quite large. They had pottery. The earliest pottery in the world, in fact, that we know of comes from Jomon, Japan. But they were they were foragers. They were hunting and gathering. Fish and shellfish was a major part of their diet. And so this is just evidence that there's a lot of paths towards sedentism, that you don't necessarily have to be a hunter or a farmer or a herder. You can actually be sedentary and create quite complex communities with hunted and gathered subsistence. In China, it they developed domesticated species quite early, though. Earlier than 10,000 years ago, there was pottery. They were living in caves, but also large settlements. And they were in the Yangtze Valley. They were eating wild plants and animals, including wild rice. And so there's evidence for wild rice being cultivated, wild rice being exploited in the Yangtze Valley in southern China earlier than 10,000 years ago. And in northern China, unfortunately, loess soil formation has buried so many sites that it's really hard for us to get any information. So surveys don't really help us very well in northern China. In the Yangtze River Valley, the Pengtushan site was inhabited about 9,000 years ago. And it seems as though they were harvesting domesticated rice. So by 9,000 years ago, it seems as though this use of wild rice has then selected certain characteristics that we can call domesticated. And their houses were built with ditches around them, probably to protect from things like flooding. Also, management of the landscape was important. So we find at the Bashidang site, which is slightly later than the Pengtushan, but similar, there were found 30,000 square meter rice fields. So this is cultivation of rice. This is becoming an important part of their economy and subsistence, and they're manipulating huge areas of land to try and control that. But you also find at this site wild animal bones, so hunting is still a part of their economy. In the Huai River Valley, at the Jiahu site, from about 9 to 8,000 years ago, you also have rice fields. This is 5,500 square meters, or more than 11 acres. You find houses at this site, pits with graves, pits and graves, but you also find wild animals again. So there's a mixed economy of domesticated rice, but also hunting. And also some social things like bone flutes are found. In the Yellow River Valley, from about 8,000 years ago, the Peligang culture from about 6,500 years ago. We're going to come back to this later on when we talk about the Yangshao culture. And this is development of more complex state-level societies, the early forms of that. And at the Banpo site, also in the Yellow River Valley, you have houses represented of two types, and so they have variations. They have wild resources, but they also have evidence for domesticated dogs, pigs, and millet, and quite elaborate pottery as well. In Hemudu in South China, this is contemporary with Banpo site. You have rice being cultivated, and also dogs, pigs, and water buffalo. And this community had raised houses above a pond, and we've found preserved wood that shows that this would have been houses on stilts. The society, we can tell a little bit more about this than some other places. In the Yangshao burials that we'll look at later on, women were probably very important for early farming communities, and it seems as though they were the burials of young girls with grave goods show that there was probably a matrilineal society. In other words, you traced your lineage through your mother's side, and so women had an important role in society. But once establishment of property and territoriality became more important in these communities, it seems as though there was a shift into patrilineal society. So tracing your identity through your male inheritance. And so property owners seem to have become men, and then the importance of what was once a matrilineal society became a patrilineal society, and the role of females in that group became diminished. So there are some parallels that we can see with some other places. We've seen already in Africa, pottery predates agriculture, and so in Japan it predates it by almost 10,000 years, and in China it predates it by agriculture only by a 1,000 or 2 years, but still it does seem as though pottery tends to predate agriculture. And also hunter-gatherers or foragers of some sort were already gathering in large settlements, and so sedentism seems to predate domestication. And so it might just be familiarity with your resources that led to managing and controlling those resources into the point of domestication. But in the case of Japan, they didn't. Not until they did not independently invent any sort of domesticated plant species. But all of these large settlements of hunter-gatherers seem to have created houses. So they had a sense of place and home and space, perhaps even property, from very early on. The domestication of plants and animals also seems to have occurred relatively in conjunction with one another at the same time. And also the development of agriculture doesn't really, at least early on, equate to increase in the settlement size. And so this doesn't seem to have been a huge impact on their way of doing things. Wild rice became domesticated rice. You had to organize your landscape, but that doesn't, through creating rice fields, but that doesn't seem to have increased the size of settlements significantly. And so there are two independent domestications that took place at this time in East Asia. So rice in southern China, millet in northern China, and the domestication of animals overlaps. And there's large sedentary villages from very early on. In some places you have defensive ditches, and so, for example, Pengtushan, Bashigan, and Jiahu all have defensive ditches around their settlements, probably to prevent freeloaders or invaders or rivals or even wild animals from coming in. So it seems as though there may be a link between these large villages of hunters and gatherers that were becoming so familiar with their sedentary way of life that domestication arose out of that. All right, and there's a few more things that your book says about summarizing this transition of the Neolithic Revolution, but I've already talked plenty about that, so I'll let you go over that. But as we can see from the multiple examples from around the world, it was a varied and complex process. It was based on what local resources were available and what climate and environment you found yourself in, and also what the specific circumstances of your social organization were. That led to a variety of trajectories towards Neolithization, or the shift from hunting and gathering into farming, herding, and sedentism. All right, that's it for this chapter. I'll see you next time.